The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in a rhythm like a sleeping machine. Oak Creek Memorial's trauma ward carried the smell of stale coffee layered beneath antiseptic, a combination that Ashley Cooper had stopped noticing 3 years ago. The linoleum under her boots was scuffed from 1,000 shifts, and she moved through the controlled chaos with a kind of efficiency that made her invisible to everyone except the ones who needed saving. She was 38 years old and had learned long ago that quiet people could hold the weight of rooms without anyone realizing what they carried. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs like an old secret. She never removed the jacket, even in summer. Even in Jacksonville heat that turned the parking lot into rippling asphalt. The patch was faded now, barely visible if you knew where to look, which no one did. Ashley moved through the break room at 6:19 a.m., her shift starting in 13 minutes. The coffee machine wheezed as it dispensed the third pot of the morning. Around her, 3 nurses laughed at something on someone's phone, and she took her cup to the corner table. Her hands, steady hands, scarred hands that had held lives together in places most people couldn't imagine, wrapped around the ceramic like a meditation. She was built lean, economical with her movements. Her dark hair was pulled back in a braid that had seen better days. There was a surgical scar along her collarbone, visible when she wore scrubs, and no one ever asked where it came from. People didn't ask about scars in hospitals. Everyone had them. Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrived on the unit at 7:02 a.m. like a man entering territory he owned. He was 54, silver-haired in the way that suggested expensive maintenance, and he moved through Oak Creek Memorial with the bearing of someone who'd never been questioned. His board connections ran deep, his family had endowed a wing in 1987, and his control over the trauma hierarchy was absolute. Chief of surgery. Unilateral. Unaccountable. He wore his authority in the cut of his jacket. Ashley had watched him for 3 years and understood exactly what he was, a man whose power depended on everyone remembering he was in charge. He gave orders. People obeyed. The system hummed. It was a simple ecosystem, and she had learned not to disturb it. But something shifted in that ecosystem when she saved a patient's life against his instruction. The ambulance came through at 7:19 a.m. Code 2, trauma incoming, 6-year-old male, found unresponsive in the scrub brush south of the base, no visible identification. The paramedics handed off vitals like a song they'd sung 1,000 times: respiratory distress, oxygen saturation 64% and dropping, altered mental status. The child's skin had the gray cast that meant shock was closing in. His small frame looked swallowed by the stretcher. Trauma Bay 3, Ashley said, and her voice carried the kind of authority that had nothing to do with rank on a hospital badge. The junior nurses moved. They always did. She could direct traffic with silence and presence. She had learned that from people who knew how to command without shouting. Dr. Caldwell appeared at her shoulder like he'd materialized from the walls. "Stabilize for sedation," he said. "Get labs. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Ashley nodded without speaking. She had learned that too, the power of not arguing. Not questioning. Not making noise. But the moment he turned his back, she was already assessing. Her hands worked through the physical exam with the precision of someone who understood that bodies told stories if you knew how to listen. The child's pupils were blown. His breath sounds were unequal on the left side. His abdomen was rigid. The signs painted a picture that didn't match simple trauma. She ordered the portable chest X-ray without waiting for orders. The film came back in 90 seconds, tension pneumothorax compressing the heart, air trapped in the pleural space, pressure building like a trap closing. This child had maybe 4 minutes before his heart stopped from being crushed inside his own chest. Ashley had seen what happened when good doctors followed bad orders. She had seen it in Marja 20 years ago. She had seen it in places she was no longer supposed to remember. Muscle memory lived in her hands regardless of what she was supposed to forget. "Get the 14 gauge, she said to her nurse. "Needle decompression. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." Dr. Caldwell said sedation, the nurse said. It wasn't defiance. It was just protocol speaking. Sedation kills this child, Ashley said. She wasn't loud. Quiet dignity didn't require volume. She was already swabbing the iodine, already finding the space between ribs that would save a life. In approximately 2 minutes. The needle went in with a hiss. Air rushed out like a trap breath finally released. The heart monitor climbed. 60. 70. 80. The oxygen saturation followed like a sunrise, 72%. 81%. 88%. The child's color deepened from ash to something close to living. His eyes fluttered open for just a moment. Conscious enough to register the ceiling. Conscious enough to see her face above him. "Phoenix," he whispered. A child's voice, small and confused. The word itself was impossible. It didn't belong in a hospital in Jacksonville. It belonged to a different life, a different person, a version of Ashley Cooper that the military had officially erased 20 years ago when she disappeared into civilian medicine and a silent agreement about forgetting. But she had no time to process that word. Not now. Not when his vitals were still climbing and Dr. Caldwell would return in moments and ask her to explain why she'd overridden his direct order. She moved forward anyway, because some oaths didn't have expiration dates. She stabilized the child's breathing. She started the 4. She made calls to radiology for imaging that would show them the full scope of what they were dealing with. Her hands moved on muscle memory from another life, the kind of calm that only came from having already survived the worst and chosen to survive anyway. 30 seconds. That's all it took for everything to shift. The O2 sat climbed. 84. 87. 91. The numbers ticked upward like a countdown reversal, and the child's chest rose without the mechanical assistance Caldwell had ordered. Ashley's hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of instruments calibrated through 2 decades of invisible training, her fingers finding angles and pressures that shouldn't have existed in civilian medicine. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as she secured the airway, and somewhere in the monitor's electronic chorus, a sinus rhythm emerged where flatline had ruled 3 minutes before. Dr. Caldwell stood at the foot of the bed, his face the color of old concrete. She didn't look at him. She was already moving to the supply cart, already calculating blood pressure against fluid loss, already 3 steps ahead in a choreography only her body remembered. The general's small hand gripped the bedsheet, and as her fingers checked his radial pulse, steady, strong, the kind of pulse that meant survival, he whispered a single word that stopped her breath in a way no monitor could measure. "Phoenix." The room tilted. Not visibly. Not where anyone watching would see it. But internally, in the architecture of her chest where the faded unit patch lay sewn against her ribs like an accusation, everything shifted. This child. This 6-year-old with dark hair matted from the burning vehicle in Marja, the one she'd pulled from twisted metal while rounds snapped overhead like angry wasps. The one she'd carried 3 clicks under fire to the extraction point. The one she'd whispered to, "Just stay with me, you're going to see your mother again." That boy. Now older, now in a hospital bed, now alive because she had refused to let Caldwell's sedation order become a death sentence. She took one measured breath. "You need rest," she said quietly, her voice level as a surgical laser. "Your oxygen is stable now. I'll be back to check your vitals in 20 minutes. She walked out of that room at 2:22 a.m., her pulse steady, her hands unclenched. The hallway fluorescents cast everything in their sickly white glow. At the nursing station, Marcus from the night shift was updating charts, and he glanced up as she passed. That was... He started, but she was already gone, already moving toward the supply closet, already pulling the door shut so she could let her hands shake for exactly 90 seconds before she composed them again. By morning, the child had a name in the system, a Coast Guard flag at his bedside, and a general's family flooding through the doors. That's when Caldwell made his move. He called her into the patient's room at 7:13 a.m. with a tone that sounded like an order being delivered through teeth. The family was there, the general's wife, his adult daughter, his mother in a wheelchair. The room suddenly felt very small. Caldwell stood near the bed with his arms crossed, his $500 blazer catching the morning light like armor, and when he opened his mouth, his voice carried the confidence of a man who had never been questioned successfully. "Ms. Cooper," he said, and the way he said it made it sound like an accusation. "I need to discuss your conduct last night with this patient's family present." Ashley stood in the doorway, her hands at her sides. "You directly countermanded my clinical order," Caldwell continued, stepping closer to the bed, closer to the general, playing to his audience like a theater actor. "You administered an unauthorized procedure without consultation, without proper protocol, without the approval of the attending physician. You put this patient at risk with reckless improvisation." The general's wife's face tightened. His daughter leaned forward slightly. "I understand your concern, Doctor," Ashley said, her voice quiet as water. One measured breath. But the patient was deteriorating. His oxygen saturation was 48%. He was... "I didn't ask for an explanation," Caldwell cut her off, his voice taking on the sharp edge of someone accustomed to obedience. "I asked you to follow protocol. Instead, you acted like you're the attending physician here. You're not. You're just a nurse who thinks she knows better than a doctor with 30 years of experience." The word just hung in the air like a suspended blade. Ashley's jaw didn't clench. Her eyes didn't narrow. A single tear formed at the corner of her left eye and she wiped it away with her index finger without breaking eye contact with Caldwell, without looking away from his face long enough for him to see fear or shame. What he saw instead was something that flickered across his expression, a moment where he realized he hadn't broken anything. The tear was information, not weakness. "I've seen what happens when good people follow bad orders, Doctor," she said quietly. "I won't watch another person die for your ego." The silence was the kind that happens in hospitals when someone says something true and it lands wrong. Caldwell's face flushed deep red, the color of rage meeting humiliation. He opened his mouth, closed it. The general's daughter stared at him. His wife's hand moved to her husband's shoulder. "You're done here," Caldwell said finally, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. "Leave the room. Now." She left without hurrying, without shame, without the performance of contrition. She walked out of that room and down the hallway to the break room where she'd spent 3 years laughing with nurses named Sarah and Jen and Marcus. Where she'd celebrated birthdays and complained about the insurance company and listened to stories about their kids and their divorces and their dreams of traveling to Costa Rica. She sat down at the table with her coffee. Sarah looked up, saw her, and stood immediately, murmuring something about needing to check her patient. Jen followed. Marcus lingered for exactly 2 seconds before finding a reason to leave. The room cleared around her like water around something cold, and no one came back for the entire hour she sat there. By noon, her name was on the public write-up board in the staff area. Insubordination and reckless patient endangerment. Typed in Caldwell's preferred font. Posted where every nurse, every resident, every staff member in the hospital would see it and adjust their calculations about who Ashley Cooper was and whether she could be trusted. She read it once and didn't read it again. Caldwell was already making calls. She would learn this later, 3 conversations with board members describing her as mentally unstable and possibly fabricating credentials, insinuating that a trauma nurse with flawless performance reviews for 3 years had somehow been hiding psychological instability. He reassigned her entire support staff, shifted her schedule to night shifts, isolated her in a pattern as calculated and methodical as a chess opening. He was competent at institutional destruction. He understood how to use policy like a weapon, how to turn a hierarchy against someone standing at the bottom. Within hours, every clinical decision she made would require documentation. Every patient interaction would be scrutinized. Every breath of oxygen she delivered would be justified in triplicate. He was going to bury her methodically, using the system she'd spent 3 years respecting. Using the hospital that she'd thought was her place of refuge. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, the general crashed again. It was 2:38 a.m. when the monitors went haywire. Ashley wasn't supposed to be there. Dr. Caldwell had rewritten the schedule after her defiance, isolating her on the graveyard shift where fewer eyes watched, where his authority went unquestioned in the fluorescent dark. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as she stood at the nursing station reviewing charts when the alarm cut through the silence like a knife. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 3. She knew before she arrived who it would be. The general's second collapse in 72 hours. His lungs were filling again, the tension building in his chest cavity like a time bomb counting down. She could feel it in her bones, that old instinct, the part of her that had assessed casualties across 3 continents and learned to read death before it announced itself. The resident on call was already there, panicking, hands shaking as he reached for the wrong needle. Wrong gauge. Wrong approach. He was going to make it worse. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, watching like a referee at a cockfight. He was timing this. Measuring how far she would go. Ashley moved without permission. Her posture shifted, shoulders back, spine straight, movements becoming economical and precise. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 12 years of field medicine compressed into 4 seconds of decision. Move. Not a request. It was a command. The resident froze. But Ashley was already positioning her hands, already assessing the intercostal space at the second rib, already knowing the anatomy the way other people knew their own address. Pain was data. Pain was information about what the body needed to survive. I need a 14-gauge angiocath and tape, she said, voice dropping into registers these people had never heard from her. Now. The nurse handed her the supplies without hesitation. There was something in the way Ashley had spoken, not a question, not a suggestion. Authority that couldn't be argued with. She found the spot. Midclavicular line. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from a life before Jacksonville, before the uniform change from sand-colored to hospital blue. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure equalizing. The monitor's pitch changed instantly. O2 sat climbing. 68. 72. 79. 85. 88. 92. Stable. The room went dead silent. Dr. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old bone. He was staring at her hands, specifically at the faded marks on her left wrist, visible now because her sleeve had rolled back during the procedure. Scars in a particular pattern. Military issue. Tactical gear wear marks from 2 decades ago. What are you doing? His voice came out strangled. My job, Ashley said quietly. Unless you want to override me again. The general's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, just a moment, he focused on her face. His lips moved. His hand reached out, trembling with the effort, and his fingers brushed her sleeve. The tremor stopped when he touched the fabric. Phoenix, he whispered. You came back. The words hung in the air like a detonation. Dr. Caldwell's jaw clenched. He'd heard it. Everyone in the bay had heard it. The coded call sign. The recognition. The proof that something else was happening here, something beyond a simple nurse saving a patient. Something that threatened the narrative he'd constructed, the story where Ashley was just another subordinate to manage. Clear the bay, he said flatly. This patient needs isolation precautions. New protocol, effective immediately. It was strategic. Brilliant, actually, in its calculated cruelty. If she was isolated with the patient, if she was the only one permitted in his room, then no one else could witness whatever connection existed between them. No one could ask questions. No one could investigate. But it was also the moment everything tipped. Because Dr. Caldwell had seen something he couldn't unsee, and now he needed her gone before the question started. Ashley finished her assessments, noted the vitals, documented every detail with the precision of someone who'd written incident reports on 3 continents. The MRE packet she'd used sat on the tray beside her, a piece of field equipment that had no business existing in a civilian trauma bay. Sealed. Sterile. Made for emergency use in conditions where hospitals were rubble and the nearest medic was 20 kilometers away. She didn't hide it. She couldn't. The evidence was already in his hands. By 6:16 a.m., when her shift ended, Dr. Caldwell had already made his calls. By 7:15 a.m., security was waiting at the employee entrance. The guard wouldn't meet her eyes as he deactivated her badge, the small blue rectangle that had been her pass into another life. "I'm sorry," he said. The apology sounded real. He said I had to do it immediately. "What am I being terminated for?" Ashley asked, though she already knew. Unauthorized procedures. Possession of non-medical materials. Insubordination. And the guard hesitated, glancing at the termination papers in his other hand, and something about your credentials being falsified. "There's an investigation." She took the envelope without speaking. Inside was her badge, the papers, and a copy of the report that would follow her to every hospital in America. Not just fired. Blacklisted. The rain started as she walked to her car, a light drizzle that within minutes became something heavier. By the time she pulled out of the Oak Creek Memorial parking lot, it was coming down like judgment. Ashley drove to the Veterans Cemetery on the edge of Jacksonville where the headstones stood in ordered rows, each one a story of service, each one a debt the country had already decided it couldn't fully repay. She knew the location without the GPS, she'd been here enough times in the years since Thomas died. The rain soaked through her scrubs as she knelt in front of the marker. Thomas J. Cooper. Sergeant, U.S. Marines. 28 years old. The dates of his birth and death were separated by a span so brief it seemed like a typo on the stone. "I tried," she whispered, her hand pressing against the engraved name. "I tried to be invisible like they ordered. Like you begged me to before the IED. You asked me to disappear, and I did. I became Ashley from nowhere, nobody from Jacksonville, just a trauma nurse who healed people and asked no questions. I was good at it, Tom. For 3 years I was good at being someone else." The rain hammered the cemetery like applause. But he was 6 years old when I pulled him from that burning transport in Marja. He was screaming, and his lungs were full of smoke, and nobody else was coming. Now he's wearing a general's stars and his body's failing because of the same fire, and I couldn't. Her voice fractured. She pulled her sleeve up, pressed her wrist against the wet stone. I couldn't watch him die twice. Even if it meant I broke the rules. Even if it meant I failed us both. Inside her jacket, sewn carefully into the lining with thread she'd purchased from a craft store in 2004, was the only physical proof of who she'd been before Jacksonville. A unit patch. Faded. Threadbare. The edges curling with age. It was less than 3 inches across, but it pressed against her ribs like an accusation, like every classified operation, every casualty list, every name she'd buried in her own memory to survive. The patch felt like a heartbeat against her chest, steady, present, impossible to ignore. She knelt there in the rain, water streaming off her hair, soaking into her clothes, running off the granite headstone like tears the stone itself couldn't cry. Tomorrow there would be calls to make. Tomorrow there would be the slow catastrophe of searching for work with a blacklisted credential and a termination for cause. Tomorrow she would become exactly what Caldwell wanted, a ghost, a cautionary tale, another person who'd learned not to challenge the hierarchy. But tonight, kneeling at her late husband's grave, Ashley Cooper was something else entirely. She was a soldier still wearing her uniform under borrowed skin. And buried underneath her quiet existence was the only weapon that had ever truly mattered, the kind of dangerous that doesn't need to announce itself. 2 days. That's all it would take. The apartment was half empty when the phone rang. Cardboard boxes stacked like tombstones. Ashley had been folding the same scrub top for 3 minutes, not moving, just holding it. The phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Ms. Cooper?" A woman's voice. Clinical. Urgent. "This is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen from Coast Guard Medical Operations. We need you to come back to Oak Creek. Now." Ashley's hand tightened on the fabric. I don't work there anymore. The general. The patient you treated. His regained consciousness and his refusing all treatment until we find someone. He keeps asking for the nurse who knew Marja. He's asking for Phoenix. The line crackled. Static like distant rotors. He's unstable. Vitals are erratic. He's saying if Phoenix doesn't walk through that door in the next 2 hours, he's done. He's going to pull his central line himself. Ashley set the scrub top down. The rain outside had started again, that same steady hammering that had been falling for 2 days straight. I can't come back. Dr. Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell is no longer relevant to this conversation. We're sending a vehicle. It will be there in 6 minutes. You have 1 bag. That's all you need. The line went dead. 6 minutes. Ashley moved without thinking, muscle memory taking over like it always did. She grabbed the leather jacket hanging by the door, the one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, pressed against her ribs like an accusation, like a prayer. She didn't pack anything else. She didn't need to. Some things you carry inside. The black Suburban pulled up exactly on time. 2 Coast Guard officers in dress blue sat in the front. No one spoke during the drive. Rain hammered the windows. Jacksonville blurred past like a fever dream. Ashley stared at her hands. Steady. After everything, they were still steady. Oak Creek Memorial appeared through the downpour like a ship emerging from fog. The Suburban pulled directly to the emergency entrance. The officers didn't move. He's on the 3rd floor. Intensive care. Room 317. The driver didn't turn around. Major, he's been asking for you since he opened his eyes. The rain hit her face like applause as she stepped out. The hospital doors slid open. Fluorescent light. That chemical smell of antiseptic and hope and terminal cases. Her badge was gone, but her hand still remembered every corridor in this place. 3rd floor. Intensive care. The officers followed silently, their presence like a shield or a cage. Ashley couldn't decide which. Room 317 had the curtain drawn. Through the gap, she could see monitors. O2 sat 91. Heart rate elevated. A ventilator standing by, waiting. She pulled the curtain back. The general was awake. Fully conscious. Tubes running into his arms like an octopus with careful, practiced movements. His eyes found her and something inside them cracked open. Recognition. Memory. 20 years collapsed into a single breath. He tried to sit up. Monitors screamed. Sir, you need to stay, a nurse started. He ignored her. His hand shot out and grabbed Ashley's wrist. His grip was iron-wrapped in paper skin. Tears were already streaming down his face, but his voice was steady. Military steady. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Major Cooper. His eyes locked on hers like a targeting system. Phoenix 6. You carried me out of that burning vehicle in Marja. You held me while the medevac came. You told me I was going to live. His hand tightened. You were right. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside. Ashley didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't pull her hand away. She just stood there, and for the first time in 2 days, she breathed. The Coast Guard Lieutenant Colonel stepped forward. His hands were shaking. Physically trembling. He was holding a classified file, the kind with the red border, the kind that's supposed to stay buried in a Pentagon basement forever. He opened it with the reverence of a priest opening scripture. Major Ashley Cooper. He read the name like it was a resurrection. For actions in the field, above and beyond the call of duty, Marja District, Helmand Province, 2003 to 2005. He stopped. Looked up at her. Looked back at the file. His voice dropped to something barely audible. You have no idea who you're standing next to. Dr. Caldwell had appeared in the doorway. Ashley saw his face drain. Saw the color leave like someone had pulled a plug. She didn't look at him. She looked at the lieutenant colonel. The SEAL team leader stepped forward. She was younger than Ashley, maybe 40, with a scar across her left temple and eyes that had seen things. Her uniform was dress blues, but her presence was pure combat. She stood at attention. Bronze Star with Valor. Her voice was ceremony. For actions in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, conducting medical evacuation under direct fire, sustaining 2 serious injuries, refusing evacuation until all personnel were recovered. The room absorbed that. Then, Silver Star. A longer pause. First Silver Star, same deployment. Emergency medical response during ambush in the Sanjin Valley. 18 friendly forces evacuated. 0 KIA because of your actions that night. Another silence. The weight of it was physical. Second Silver Star. Kandahar Province, 2005. You stayed with a wounded Afghan civilian for 7 hours in a minefield. You talked to him. You kept him conscious. You called in the clearance team. The SEAL leader's eyes were wet. That civilian was an informant. Intelligence asset. Because you kept him alive, we got the coordinates for a Taliban weapons cache that saved 200 Marines 6 months later. You never knew that. Dr. Caldwell tried to back out of the room. A Coast Guard officer moved, blocking his path. Not aggressive. Just a wall. The SEAL leader continued. And the Distinguished Service Cross. The highest non-Medal of Honor award our service gives. She swallowed. Classified Operation, Logar Province, 2005. You extracted 43 personnel from a facility that was being demolished. 43 people who officially don't exist. You carried 14 of them yourself. You were shot 3 times. You stayed in the field for 18 additional hours providing emergency treatment to wounded who couldn't be moved immediately. The SEAL leader's voice broke slightly. You've saved more lives than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. The general was still holding Ashley's wrist. His grip had softened but hadn't released. She could feel his pulse against her palm. Fast. Fighting. Alive. Your husband. The SEAL leader glanced at the file in the lieutenant colonel's hands. Your late husband, Michael Cooper. Army Ranger. You two met in 2002 during a joint task force operation in Kandahar. You were married 18 months later. When the Pentagon ordered you to disappear, he disappeared with you. He took a civilian job. He never told anyone. Not his family. Not his friends. Not even his therapist. The SEAL leader paused. The file says he asked you to stay quiet. To just live a normal life and forget the uniform. And you tried. For 20 years, you tried. Ashley's eyes were burning. But soldiers don't cry. Not in public. Not while being watched. She kept her gaze level, jaw steady, breathing measured. One tear escaped despite everything. She didn't wipe it away. Then a 6-year-old child crashed into your emergency room. The SEAL leader looked at the general. At the man who had been that child once, before the military took him, trained him, made him into command. And you couldn't forget anymore. You couldn't stay invisible. Because the worst part about being a ghost is watching people die when you know you could save them. Dr. Caldwell's face had gone grey. Not pale. Grey like ash. Like something already cremated. Major Ashley Cooper, the lieutenant colonel said quietly, reading from the file one more time, you are hereby recognized for service rendered to the United States Coast Guard and Allied military forces. Your records have been reclassified and restored. Your rank, your service, your sacrifices, all of it is acknowledged. He closed the file. Welcome home. The room exhaled. Ashley finally looked at Dr. Caldwell. Just one look. The kind of look that carries no anger, no vindication, no satisfaction. Just the quiet knowledge of who she was and who he'd always been. She said nothing. Sometimes silence is the most devastating sentence of all. The general squeezed her wrist one more time. "You came back," he whispered. "I never left," Ashley said. "I was just waiting for the right person to ask for Phoenix." The doors burst open. FBI. 2 agents with badges hanging from lanyards, boots on tile, 1, 2, 3, 4, moving with the precision of people who'd walked into 1,000 rooms exactly like this one. Dr. Caldwell's face drained of color like someone had opened a valve. The general's hand tightened around Ashley's wrist. The SEAL team leader stepped back. The hospital corridor, which had been electric with recognition and revelation, went utterly still. The lead agent, a woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, moved directly to Caldwell. "Dr. Robert Caldwell." Not a question. A command dressed in 5 words. Caldwell's mouth opened. Closed. His hand found the wall to steady himself. "I don't understand what." Multiple calls to board members. The agent's voice carried the weight of documentation behind it. Systematic character assassination. Allegations of credential fraud. And here's where it gets interesting. "Doctor, you filed a formal complaint with state medical licensing that Major Cooper's military record was forged. That you had evidence of falsification." She pulled a folder from her partner's hands. "Except there's one problem. Her record is real. Everything in it. We've verified every commendation, every deployment, every operation. Which means you fabricated evidence to discredit a decorated officer. That's attempted forgery of federal military documents. That's obstruction. That's conspiracy." Caldwell's hands began to shake. Not the controlled tremor of a professional under stress. This was the shaking of someone watching his entire architecture collapse in real time. "I was trying to protect the hospital. Patient safety. Save it." The second agent was already producing handcuffs. Metal clicked. The sound was surgical, precise. "You have the right to remain silent." Ashley watched without expression as the agents guided Caldwell toward the corridor. His eyes found hers once, a look that contained desperation, rage, and the dawning realization that institutional authority meant nothing when you were standing across from federal investigators. He'd spent 20 years building his power through hospital politics, board connections, the careful cultivation of favor and leverage. And it had taken exactly 4 minutes for the FBI to dismantle every bit of it. As they passed the nurses' station, every head turned. The same nurses who'd laughed with Ashley 3 days ago, who'd abandoned her in the break room, who'd watched her name appear on the insubordination board, they watched now in absolute silence. One nurse's hand covered her mouth. Another stood so still she might have been holding her breath. The lead agent paused, just for a moment, letting the moment breathe. Then Caldwell was guided past, and the full weight of what had just happened settled over the unit like a deployed parachute. "Selling insurance." Ashley's voice was quiet enough that only the general heard it. From a folding table at a strip mall. The general made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was more like a sob. The medical team dispersed. The curious onlookers retreated. Within 90 seconds, it was just Ashley and the general in the room. The machines that had been screaming moments before now reduced to the soft rhythm of normal monitoring, heart rate 72, blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation holding steady at 96%. Everything the way it should be. Everything the way it was supposed to be when you did the right thing regardless of cost. The general's hand, though, was still shaking. And then, slowly, with the determination of someone whose body was learning again how to obey commands, he shifted his weight. His legs moved. His core engaged. He was young enough that his body still remembered discipline, old enough that every movement cost him. He lowered himself to one knee beside Ashley's wheelchair. Then the other knee. He was kneeling on the tile floor of a hospital room in Jacksonville, Florida, in front of a woman who'd spent 2 decades erased from history, and he was crying without sound. Ashley's weathered hand, the one that had held trauma shears, that had applied chest seals fashioned from improvised materials, that had written careful notes about patients no one else was paying attention to, moved slowly until her palm covered the top of his head. The gesture was simple. Devastating. Complete. At ease, soldier, she whispered. Her voice had dropped an octave. The voice of someone who'd given orders in the dark, who'd made calls that saved lives or ended them, who'd carried weight that the world would never know about. We both made it home this time. The general nodded against her hand. His shoulders shook. Somewhere in the hospital, a monitor beeped. Somewhere else, a page announced a routine transfer. The machinery of Oak Creek Memorial rolled forward, indifferent to the fact that everything had just shifted on its axis. Within the hour, the hospital's chief medical officer called Ashley into his office. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. They offered her the position of Chief of Trauma Services. They offered a salary that was almost triple what she'd earned as a floor nurse. They offered an office on the 4th floor, administrative authority, the chance to rebuild the trauma department into something that actually prioritized patient outcomes over hierarchy. Ashley listened to each offer with her hands folded in her lap. When the CMO finished, she stood. "I'll take the trauma position," she said. "I'm declining the office. I want to work in scrubs. For days a week on the floor, 1 day for mentoring the next generation. And I want to establish a veteran-specific care protocol. The ones who've seen the worst are often the ones who need the most, and they'll only trust someone who understands what they've survived." The CMO blinked. "You're turning down administration." "I'm turning down distance," Ashley said. Her eyes were level with his. "Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. I'm keeping the ability." She was back on the floor by the next morning. By week 3, she'd trained for new nurses on the chest seal protocol. By week 2 of the next month, 3 of them had saved lives using techniques that Dr. Caldwell would have called violations. The hospital had quietly updated its protocols to include what it was now calling advanced field improvisation procedures, which was another way of saying Ashley's methods, legitimized and formalized into something the institution could control. 2 months after Caldwell's arrest, the local news ran a follow-up piece. They'd found him working at a minute clinic in a strip mall in Tucson, Arizona. The byline read, "Former hospital administrator now working entry-level position." The photo showed a man in a name tag that read Steve restocking bandages. His hands looked uncertain. His face looked like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to win. Ashley didn't watch the video. She was too busy. The barista at the coffee shop outside the hospital started writing her name correctly on the cup, not Ashley, but Major. It was a small thing. It was everything. She almost smiled the first time she saw it. The man behind the counter was a veteran. Of course he recognized the shift in her bearing, the way she moved through the world, the quality of her silence. He'd noticed something in her the very first time she ordered coffee, 3 weeks into her return. Now he just nodded when she came in. No questions. The nod was enough. On her one administrative day each week, Ashley sat in a small office and reviewed applications from nurses and paramedics who wanted training in the techniques that had saved the Coast Guard general's life. She got 200 applications in the first month. She selected 8. By the end of the year, those 8 would have saved 43 lives using protocols that nobody had authorized before she'd forced the institution's hand. The trembling in her hands, which had started the day she received the termination papers, which had persisted through the cemetery, through the phone call, through the identity reveal, stopped completely 3 weeks after Caldwell was escorted out. It wasn't fear that had been making her hand shake. It was restraint. The discipline of a soldier holding herself to a standard of conduct that the world didn't know to demand of her. Months of suppressing reflex, hiding capability, accepting humiliation as the price of invisibility. That restraint, once released, had a momentum of its own. Her hand steadied when the restraint was no longer necessary. When the world finally knew who was standing in front of them. Scars tell stories. The one on her left shoulder, 3 inches long, diagonal, barely visible under a long-sleeve scrub top, was from a shrapnel wound in Helmand Province. The one on her collarbone was from surgery, not combat. The ones on her palms were from 1,000 small cuts and burns that came from 20 years of trying to heal people who trusted her with their most fragile moments. Those last scars were the important ones. Those were the ones that mattered. The general was discharged on day 9. He stood in the hospital corridor with his family, and before they guided him toward the elevator, he found Ashley coming back from a supply run. He saluted, not casual, but formal, the kind that soldiers reserve for superiors and peers. She returned it without hesitation. The gesture was small enough that most people wouldn't have recognized what they were looking at. But the nurses at the station understood. The orderlies passing through understood. The hospital had just witnessed 2 soldiers acknowledging each other across the distance of time and circumstance and impossible luck. After he was gone, after she'd watched the elevator doors close and felt the particular silence that comes after a significant person leaves your orbit, Ashley went back to the trauma bay. There was a 14-year-old with a lacerated brachial artery being prepped for surgery. The attending was a good surgeon but cautious, moving with technical precision but without the instinctive understanding of how trauma actually demanded to be treated. Ashley stepped up. "Let me see the imaging." "No, please." No deference. Just command. The attending handed over the tablet. "Okay," Ashley said. "Here's what we're doing. Size 14 French catheter. We're going subsonic with the pressure to avoid vascular rupture. I want suction ready and 2 units of ONEG cross-matched, type and screen. And get me a vascular surgeon down here. We're going to clamp and explore, which means we need someone who can repair if this goes lateral." The surgical team moved. Not because she held a title. Because they could hear in her voice that she'd done this before. Because they could feel the authority that came from having survived things that would have broken most people. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding it all together. That teenager walked out of the hospital 4 days later with a fully functional arm. His mother cried and thanked Ashley 17 times. Ashley nodded, changed her gloves, and moved on to the next patient. The work was what mattered. The work was always what mattered. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story, someone who made assumptions based on what they could see, then you know what it costs to let them keep those assumptions. But you also know what it feels like when the truth finally surfaces, when the real picture becomes impossible to ignore. Ashley Cooper had lived both sides of that equation. She'd been dismissed as just a nurse. She'd been revealed as Major Phoenix 6. And in the end, she'd chosen to be both, in scrubs, on the floor, where the work was real and the stakes were written in the vital signs of people who were depending on her steady hands. The order that had sent her into the world 20 years ago said, disappear. Forget. Be nobody. She'd tried. She'd truly tried. But some people are built for more than disappearing. Some people are built to show up when it matters, to act when everyone else freezes, to choose the life in front of them over the orders behind them. Ashley had spent 2 decades as a ghost. It had only taken 4 minutes with the FBI to remind her that ghosts don't save lives, soldiers do. And soldiers don't sell themselves short, even when the uniform is made of scrubs instead of camouflage. Subscribe if you believe the quietest warriors are often the most lethal. Like if you would have made the same choice. And comment, what would you do if the world finally saw who you really were? If you'd spent decades invisible and suddenly you had to choose between staying hidden and stepping into the light?